With March out of the way, I wanted to take a look back at some of the JRPGs that I've been playing. This video is going to be more laid back, casual, and spoiler free of course, with me going over a few JRPGs that I finished between the end of February up until the end of March. Keeping things brief and straightforward, let's just jump into things, shall we? First up is a strategy JRPG which is definitely on the obscure side of things, that being La Pucelle Ragnarok. This game is a remaster of the original PlayStation 2 title from 2002 simply called La Pucelle Tactics. Without getting too confusing, this remaster is based on the Japanese exclusive PSP re-release which added an extra epilogue, which is what the Ragnarok part of the title is referring to. Anyway, this is the first game I've ever finished that was developed by Nippon Ichi Software, who are mostly known for the Disgaea series. This is very apparent with the game's art style and gameplay, especially with it being a strategy RPG. I actually really like this game. It's similar to Fire Emblem with how you can customize units, but its central mechanic similar to Disgaea is how you can tame and recruit demons. In some ways, I found its more simplistic combat system and map design to be a breath of fresh air for me personally, especially since the strategy RPG genre is known for being pretty hardcore and unforgiving. I don't mind it every now and then, but sometimes you want something a bit more easygoing, and La Pucelle definitely had that. Nippon Ichi Software is also known for having some amazing pixel art and sprite animations, and this title definitely had that. Playing this on an OLED display definitely allowed it to pop. It made me miss that era where a lot of big budget titles had pixel art, which is something that doesn't really exist today. Story wise, things are very simple and light-hearted. You play as Priya, the main protagonist, and it's mostly comedic in tone, having her be a nun for the Holy Church who essentially go around purifying villages as demon hunters for the church. Priya herself, however, is where this game truly shines. She's definitely a more unconventional protagonist. Her main goal and objective throughout the story can pretty much be boiled down to her wanting to become a god. I don't really read manga or light novel series, but it definitely had that kind of short story tone to the overall vibe of the game. Outside of Priya, the supporting cast is also very likeable. The story overall is pretty decent and it gave me enough intrigue to want to finish this title. On top of that, this title is also the perfect length in my opinion, taking me around 30 hours to beat. I will say though, my only complaint really is with the late game dungeon. It has all the obnoxious level design that you would expect in this kind of genre. Add on to the fact that there's a bit of a difficulty spike during this moment and you have a very frustrating section of this game. But despite that small issue, I would very much recommend this title. Especially if you're a fan of Vanillaware's games, since it very much reminded me of those releases. It has that same unique kind of PS2 vibe going for it, especially since it's on the more obscure side of things. Overall, La Pucelle was a great experience and was a light-hearted title that I very much needed at the time. Playing this title on the Nintendo Switch was perfect with its handheld nature. Taking it with me for a few casual games without it using up all of my attention span was a great way to experience this entry. I still need to go back and play that epilogue sometime. Anyway, moving on to the next game that I played in March. This next JRPG is definitely the one I'm the most mixed on in terms of the games that I played in March. Okay, so quick introductions. Basically, there are two Sakura Wars games in the West, the 2019 reboot and the first title to ever be localized over here, that being Sakura Wars 5. Last year I played the reboot and absolutely loved it. I was surprised at how good that entry was, especially with some of the backlash and hate that I saw surrounding this title online back in the day. So naturally, after being introduced to this series and having a pretty strong first impression, I would want to look out and seek any other games in this series that I could play. It was somewhat disappointing to learn that out of the 6 mainline games in this series, only 2 were ever officially localized here in the West. Anyway, so Sakura Wars 5 released in 2005 and it's the next game that I played in March. Like the previous entry, it's a strategy RPG, but it's also somewhat of a visual novel. One of the most common compliments that you'll see for the Sakura Wars series online is that it feels very much like playing an actual anime. Moving on to the story of this game, and I actually really enjoyed this aspect, it's definitely the strongest part of Sakura Wars 5. You play as this Japanese transfer commander who moves to New York. It's loosely set in the 1920s, so the characters reflect this in how they have no idea about the culture over there.
Ah, konbanwa, konnichiwa, and ohayo.
It has that same charm that you will typically see whenever Japan has its own take on America. This is usually seen in some video games as well as anime. I'm definitely a fan whenever I see Japan's take on the West since it's typically done pretty well. It's definitely not completely one-to-one and there are some liberties taken here and there, but it's pretty charming seeing New York condensed to fit on a PlayStation 2. Similar to La Pucelle, you're fighting against demons as part of the New York Combat Division. Once again, this JRPG leans towards the more light-hearted side of things. Its old presentation and English dub is very charming for its time, but where my thoughts start to be more negative is towards the actual gameplay of Sakura Wars 5. Once again, it's a strategy RPG and some of the earlier levels are actually alright, but things start to get pretty unfairly difficult towards the end. It has all the unfair staples that you would expect from this subgenre. Personally, the older I get, the more I find that I don't really enjoy strategy RPGs sometimes. There are still some great strategy RPGs out there, but Sakura Wars 5 has some pretty bad level design. It relies a lot on gimmicks, sometimes you'll be defending an objective, and then sometimes with boss fights things can get very frustrating with how you have to destroy each part of the boss. But the game barely communicates this fact to you, there's a lot of moments of trial and error which can lead to even more frustration. Anyway, I don't want this to turn into a massive strategy RPG rant, but overall I'm pretty negative towards the actual gameplay of Sakura Wars 5, but still its presentation is incredible and has aged very well with its anime cutscenes. Definitely the most mixed game that I played in March, but still decent overall. I'm glad I played this title, but also the length for me is another complaint I have. It took me about 50 hours long and things really start to drag towards the end of the experience. Overall, it's a good time, but not as good as the 2019 reboot in my opinion. Ooh, now we have a more positive note. Moving from my least favourite JRPG that I played in March to my most favourite, we have the recently released Xenoblade Chronicles X Definitive Edition. I'm gonna have to hold myself back on this one, or else this video could easily be an hour long, but this game is incredible. I've gotta say, being a long-time fan of video games, there's a lot of discourse that you see online every single day. One of the best feelings out there with this hobby is being able to go back to a game that you grew up with and find out that it still holds up to this day. Almost 10 years later, Xenoblade X is a masterpiece today as much as it was back in 2015. It's crazy looking back at the original release, since Xenoblade Chronicles X was the first JRPG that I ever managed to beat that wasn't Paper Mario. On top of that fact, it was also the first open world game that I'd ever played. Needless to say, my nostalgia for this entry is pretty up there. I literally have no negatives for this title, the Definitive Edition just adds on to an already incredible experience. They added new party members, extra storylines, and even upgraded some of the original cast into fully playable characters. Keeping things brief, this is still in my opinion the best open world game out there, both visually and gameplay wise. This title came out before the open world format became oversaturated and was given a formula, so you'll see no obnoxious radio towers or constant hand-holding with dopamine treasure chests here. Also, by far the best aspect to the open world experience for this game, which sets it apart from other open world games out there, is with its mech traversal. One of the most disappointing aspects of modern gaming, and this isn't clickbait by the way, is how so many experiences give you the same generic course to traverse the open world with. Look, courses are pretty cool, but with a video game you can do so much more, and the mechs in Xenoblade X are a perfect example of this. Definitive Edition even further adds on to this fact, giving you even more customization options to traverse the open world. It's for this fact alone that Xenoblade X is still far above the competition when it comes to open world game design. Look, I'm not even a big fan of mechs in real life, I own no model kits and the only mecha anime that I've ever watched is Evangelion and Gridman. But there's just something really special about the mechs in Xenoblade Chronicles X. Anyway, just some smaller points before moving on. I'll always defend the story to this game. The whole rawness of you being the remains of humanity is an excellent and simple narrative device that lends itself really nicely to the open world format. I also love how the Definitive Edition fleshes out some ideas and alien races further from the original release. To me, this is still the best Xenoblade game, and I'm more adamant on this fact after replaying this game again. I genuinely have no negatives with this title. Also, if you'd like to hear a more constructive and spoiler heavy video, then please check out my latest upload I did on this game's epilogue. Okay, now moving on to the final JRPG that I played in March, we have the highly anticipated Atelier Yumiya, Alchemist of Memories and the Envisioned Land. Now, I'm going to be even more vague with this one since this is the most recent release in this video and I would hate to spoil it. I have a pretty decent history with the Atelier series. I played through the entire Riser trilogy as well as the Mysterious trilogy and some of the Dusk games. Going into Atelier Yumiya, I wasn't too sure what to expect outside of them leaning more into the open world design which was introduced in Riser 3. There's a much more mature storyline this time around, leaning more into the actual philosophy behind alchemy. I actually enjoyed how the party members were established in this one since they all have backstories that the game goes into. Whilst I'm a little mixed with the overall tone that this series is taking, I'm really impressed with the production values of Atelier Yumiya. There's so much personality put into every single animation, it really feels top notch. I'll start with my compliments for this entry, since some of the new ideas that it introduces is pretty impressive. First off, by far the best aspect of Atelier Yumiya is with the combat. Basically, it's an action RPG in almost every way. You have these cooldowns that you have to mix between. But where the combat truly shines in my opinion is how you have these Dark Souls-like dodge rolls. Okay, I know I've made some people cringe with that comment, but trust me, it's done really well here. Roll in to avoid taking damage is heavily rewarded, and being able to tag team after a successful roll to initiate a counter is some of the best feeling combat I've ever felt in a JRPG. It's very satisfying. It's a really strange comparison, but it really reminded me of the first Kingdom Hearts game. I wondered just how possible it is to do a level 1 run of this game. It really impressed me just how deep combat was in Atelier Yumiya. I'm surprised at how you could take 0 damage by successfully rolling. This time around, combat feels very much skill based and doesn't rely as much on equipment and leveling. This kind of brings me to my most negative take on Atelier Yumiya. Before getting into it, I just want to say that I have only the utmost respect for the developers behind this game, Gust. They've clearly poured tons of passion into this project, and you can really tell from just how well this game is made. But with all that being said, my biggest criticism for Atelier Yumiya is how it doesn't really feel like an Atelier game at times. The alchemy system really isn't at the forefront like the other games in this series, and a lot of it has been streamlined to the point where it's very quick and easy to get through. Without going into a massive rant, there are a ton of smaller aspects of this game that has been streamlined, and as a result of this fact, it's kind of made the alchemy system feel less important. In some ways, I really respect how Atelier Yumiya experiments with the formula, but at sometimes it's at the cost of the game no longer feeling like an Atelier entry. I'll also keep things very brief on my next criticism, and that's on the open world for this game. I'm very mixed on how this was implemented. Interviews before this game came out was a massive red flag in my opinion, saying how they was inspired by Genshin Impact when making the open world for Atelier Yumiya. That's a massive red flag by the way. No game should ever be inspired by Genshin Impact. Especially since the Atelier series came first. Anyway, back to my original rant. As a result of this fact, a lot of the criticisms that I mentioned in the Xenoblade X part of this video is apparent with Atelier Yumiya. For instance, there are just far too many treasure chests constantly giving you that dopamine rush. I really don't like when open world games do this by the way. I will say though, I'll definitely compliment the fact that this game doesn't give you a generic horse for an open world experience. It gives you this pretty cool motorbike. I definitely think that the open world in Atelier Yumiya is a step up from Rise of 3, so things are getting better. I just think it has a lot of room for improvement. Overall, it's still early days for Atelier Yumiya, and Sophie 2 is still my favourite Atelier entry. But this game definitely does a lot right, and I hope I've not been too negative with this section of the video. I am very much looking forward to finding out whether or not Atelier Yumiya will branch into a trilogy sometime down the line. Especially since its opening week has been the best selling Atelier game in its series, so things are looking very positive so far. Anyway, looking at April, things are looking interesting. There aren't really any new JRPGs coming out for this month. Outside of the new Lunar remasters, which I've never played by the way, there's nothing really on my radar for game releases in April. I have been debating whether or not to play Skies of Arcadia for the first time since I've never played that game. I've also been thinking whether or not to play an older game in the Pokemon series since I still need to go back and play those. Not to mention, everyone owns a backlog and I still have a few Yakuza games to get through. So needless to say, there's definitely something to play in April, there's just not really any new releases that have caught my eye. There's also the Switch 2 presentation which I'm highly anticipating, but that goes beyond the scope of this video. But anyway, with all that being said, what games did you play in March? Are there any favourites that you would recommend? Please let me know in the comment section. Also, any feedback on this video will be appreciated. Thank you so much for watching and I hope you have a nice rest of your day.
Do a barrel roll!